Hi, everybody. This is Joe Lample, the Joe behind Joe Gardener, and welcome to the Joe Gardener Show podcast. If you're a gardener in the UK, there is a very good chance that you already know the name Alys Fowler. From her early rise as a young gardening prodigy, steeped in orchards and walled gardens, trained at prestigious institutions like Kew and the New York Botanical Garden, and ultimately appearing on BBC television screens, such as being a regular presenter on Gardener's World and her own television series, The Edible Garden. Alys was once the face of a new generation of horticulturists, smart, curious, and deeply attuned to the natural world. So, in this first half of our conversation today, I really want you to get to know her as we trace a remarkable journey from a childhood on a small holding in the English countryside to becoming a celebrated writer and TV presenter. You'll hear how a lifelong love of plants evolved into something far more layered, more ecological, more reflective, and ultimately more radical. And that brings us to part two, the main part of this episode, because while this is a story of a well-loved and respected gardener, it's also the story of someone who chose to leave behind a very successful media career to follow a quieter, deeper calling. Peatlands, those ancient, wild, and often overlooked ecosystems that hold extraordinary power, both in their carbon storing capabilities and in their quiet beauty. Alys's newest book, Peatlands, is a love letter, a cry for help, and a call to action. And in the second half of our conversation, we explore why she chose to write it, why these bogs matter so much, and what we can all do, especially as gardeners, to protect them. This is a story in two parts, with one powerful through line, the enduring connection between people, plants, and place. Let's get into it, and I hope you enjoy it. Alys, I really appreciate you taking the time today, and we have a big topic to talk about with your book, Peatlands, and your evolution from your entree into gardening and horticulture. I'd love to talk about that first. And ultimately, the main point of our conversation today is to talk about peatlands in your book and the importance of peat bogs, and we'll get into that in a minute. But before we do, let me just stop right there, welcome you to the show, and then I'm going to get an overview of your background. So thank you, Alys, for being here, and welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited. Really like touched. You know what I mean? I'm here in a tiny little back garden in England, and it is amazing to, you never think of your ideas going very far. So it's also really exciting when you get to hook up with people all over the world. That's the joy of gardening, isn't it? It's actually a very universal thing.
It is, and I find that gardeners, no matter where they are generally very good people, and they're our people. And I love to expand the reach and meet people beyond like you. And so here we are, and that is fantastic. And I guess a nod to technology for part of that too. It'd be much better in person, but we'll do what we can. With that, I have a few questions for you before we really get into the meat of this conversation. And I always love to get kind of the backstory of your origin, and I know our listeners do as well. And so there are many people here that know you and your history, but for those that don't, or for those that do, and we want to hear from you about it, how did you come into gardening? And you have quite a storied background. So can you unhumble yourself for a minute and
Uh,
share that with us?
okay. So my mum had what would be classed a small holding. So she raised chickens to sell their eggs locally. And then we had this sort of very, very beautiful, like large walled garden. And then it was surrounded by these little orchards, and the chickens all lived beneath the orchards. Really idyllic, like just absolutely kind of textbook idyllic childhood outside. My mother is to this day still alive. And so she kind of kicked us out from the word go. Like, even when it was raining, you really had to persuade her to be allowed to stay in the house.
Wow.
And endlessly curious about everything. Like
Mhm.
every leaf, she had a lot of time for everything.
Oh,
And I think she really gave that to us, that we could look really closely at the world.
mm.
And then my dad, he's retired now, he's a very old man, but he was a doctor. So there was this funny mixture of like her kind of attention and his science. So he really wanted the reasoned answer to something. And I have to say, an incredibly wild childhood. They didn't do much parenting unless it was about the natural world. And then by the time I'd kind of got to late teens in school, trying to work out who I was and what I wanted to do, I sort of knew it had to be outside. I remember doing a funny quiz. You know, I don't know, maybe they did it in the US or not, but you do this kind of this multiple choice quiz, which is just to tell you like what job you're going to get at the end of it. And I came out with a shoemaker.
A shoemaker.
I'm not making shoes. I don't know why that came up.
And Alys, I have to jump in here because you were telling me you took those tests to say what you would be good at doing as a career. And yes, we did have those tests here in the US. And I took that test, and you'll never guess because I never thought I would get the answer that I got. But whoever grades those tests said that I would make an excellent funeral director. So that was surprising to me.
Yeah, basically, I did not take any notice of the questionnaire and decided that I wanted to be a gardener. And my mum is a really passionate gardener. Like, she had the most beautiful, I mean, she still has even though she's an old lady, has a very, very beautiful garden. And so actually, like, in hindsight, looking back on it, I can see that she sort of really steered this. Once I said I was into gardening, she went, all out to make sure that I knew what that could possibly mean. Anyhow, out of a series of luck and privilege, I got to do a kind of work experience at Kew Gardens when I was 16, 17 for the summer.
Wow.
And I just knew instantly I'd found my people. I was working in the orchid department. There, Kew has had this long history of having an apprenticeship scheme there. So it was full of young people, it was full of my people, young people who are really, really into plants and really, really into understanding plants and how they interacted and what it meant to grow them. It was sort of very much through this lens of what do they look like in the wild? How do we grow them in their communities? So, it was a very specific kind of way to grow plants as well. So once I kind of had done this summer-long work experience, I was, then somebody said, did you realize you can carry on your training here? You can come and do the Kew diploma. That was it. That was all I wanted to do. And so I applied for the Kew diploma as I left school. They offered one place a year to somebody who was 18 years old, who didn't have any kind of prior experience. And, luck was it that I became that person for that year. So then I had to go and get 2 years somewhere else before I could go to Kew. So I had to kind of prove myself for 2 years. And at the end of those 2 years, if I was good enough, I could take up my apprenticeship.
Wow.
So I went to the Royal Horticultural Society in Wisley, which is a massive giant of the British gardening world. It is the big institution of gardening. So I did my apprenticeship first year diploma there. It was way more peopled than my rural childhood, but it wasn't quite peopled enough. And I think, I can't tell you how desperate I was to get to a big city. And everybody was looking at where they would go on from Wisley. And I remember we had this huge, photocopied, I don't know, sort of document that was all the botanic gardens in the world that you could apply for.
Wow.
To go and do an apprenticeship. And everybody was taken by, I'm going to go to Hawaii, I'm going to go to Florida Botanic Garden. I remember looking down the list and going, I'm going to go to New York. And I remember the whole room going, you can't garden in New York. What are you talking about? It's like, well, there's a botanic garden, so I'm going there. So I sort of rather presumptively phoned them up and said, I want to come and do my apprenticeship with you. And they said, well, we don't have an apprenticeship scheme. And I went, oh, well, I want to do it. How can I come and work for you for a year? This was a payphone. So I was putting with 52 pieces in, calling up New York, going, what do you mean you don't have a scheme? And they said they would phone me back in 2 weeks. So I remember standing by the payphone. I was like, you will have to phone me at this hour if you say so. Anyhow, they phoned back and they said that they'd found this funny workaround. And yes, I could come for a year if I wanted to.
That is amazing. And little did your peers know how prestigious here in the States, that's probably one of the tops in the country. And good for you to push through. I love how you did that.
When you were young and you just had no idea how arrogant you're being. It seems very funny now. I mean, also, like, I cannot tell you how rural a kid I was. Like, I
Mm,
really came from very, very farming countryside.
mm.
I wanted to go to the city. I'd never really been to the city. And then 19 years old, I feel like
Wow.
I was going to New York. I remember my mum going, "Oh," and she said, "Well, your father will come with you for 2 weeks." My dad came with me for the first 2 weeks in New York. And I mean, and now I think I don't know quite what they thought 2 weeks was. He was walking around. So at one point, I lost my dad in New York Botanic Garden. Um, and this is before mobile phones or anything like that. And I remember being quite panicked and saying to somebody, "It was not where he said he would be." And you know, uh, uh, how are we going to find him? Because New York Botanic Garden is massive. And
Yeah.
somebody got on like a walkie-talkie and said, "We've lost an Englishman." And somebody like on the other end of the walkie-talkie said, "Oh yeah, we just saw him. He's the only man walking in the rain without a raincoat. He's in tweed." I was like, "Yeah, that was my dad."
Oh, that's good.
Anyhow, I really credit kind of most of my garden style actually coming from that year in New York, and I ended up living in the East Village,
Mm.
and I spent nearly all my spare time in community gardens. In one particular community garden, which I did loads and loads of work
Mm.
in, and hanging out in there and meeting people and just sort of seeing an entirely different way of being, I suppose. And at 19, if I could have stayed in New York, I would have 100% stayed. But my visa came to an end, and so and then that drew me back into Kew, and
Right.
the rest is history.
Wow. What? That's why I asked you this to tell us your story, because it's fascinating, and what a series of educational and hands-on experience you've had to build up that to where you went from there. So when you came back to the UK and you're at Kew, how long did that last, and then what happened from there?
It lasted 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
so it's like practical apprenticeship.
Mm-hmm.
And then I actually went on to do a master's in environment, society, and science, which, seems a sort of sidestep. But I quite quickly worked out that through the kind of Wesleyan Kew cohort and even the New York Botanic cohort, that like you kind of gardeners sort of fell into, at that level, fell into kind of two streams, I suppose, which is either you are a complete plant nerd who just get to know a genus or,
Mm.
a kind of type of plants, like you would be into cactus or orchids, I don't know,
Wow.
rainforest plants. And you were just going to be this kind of super geek about them. And you were going to
Mm-hmm.
know absolutely every single species and every cultivar and all of that. Or you were going to sort of do more design work, I suppose. And then I was like, I didn't want to be in either of those gangs. And actually, what I realized I was more interested in was why everybody else was so interested in gardening.
Mm.
I love gardening for myself, but I'm always absolutely fascinated why it's so kind of consuming for other people. And
Wow.
so I really wanted to understand why, as a species, we need to do this kind of form of practice around nature.
Mm.
And so that took me to, I said the nearest that I could sort of find to try and answer that was to join a geography department and look at why we talk and identify the way we do with our environment.
Yeah. You ended up with a master's degree in science, society, and the environment. Is that right?
Mhm. Yeah.
That sounds perfect. That sounds exactly perfect for what you were looking to do.
Yeah, it was good. But also, at this point, I'm still only 23. I'm totally overqualified. The only job I could really get for being a gardener. I was like, had all these highfalutin ideas, spent way too long in too many big institutions. So I was actually strangely slightly unemployable. And then thankfully, I kind of got saved by ending up as a journalist on a
Yeah.
trade magazine about horticulture, which I had no, I had no desire to be a writer or anything like that. It hadn't
Huh.
even occurred to me. It was just I could do. It was just a full-time job that offered enough money and it would allow me to stay in London. And at that point, that seemed reason enough to, it was about horticulture, so it wasn't a million miles away. I mean, I really didn't think very much about it other than I thought, okay, well, I can do this for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then that really became my entire life. So it's funny how those things work.
Yeah. And that led to some TV work too.
Yeah. I mean, that was another thing I fell into. I mean, Up until 23, I'd really planned my life, and after 23, I just fall into things. um, so I didn't have any desire to be on TV. I don't even really like being looked at by people. But what happened is I'd sort of been in print journalism in this trade magazine called Horticulture Week. And at that point, that was, I don't know, early 2000s, I suppose. And there was a lot of talk about how print media was going to die and everything was going to move online and that like there wouldn't be magazines and whatnot. And I thought, well, I kind of like what I'm doing, but it sounds like it may not be a long-term career. So I should probably look at other media. And I knew that if you joined the BBC, that they would train you, like whichever bit you joined, you could still get training in radio and online and stuff like that. So I applied to be a TV researcher because not because I had any interest in TV, but because I thought it would allow me to get into radio. But that's just my life. You know, plan things very well. They always end up being quite monumentous. And you know, I ended as a researcher, and then in a way that I still don't quite understand, I ended up on camera.
Yeah.
Initially, I hated it. I just got every time people took the camera off me, I stood into tears.
Did I hear you say when the camera turned off, you were, I guess, relieved and burst into tears?
Well, I don't know about how it works on your side, but at least back then there was a huge crew.
Yeah.
In like British terrestrial TV. So, you know, there was a cameraman and a soundman and a researcher and a producer and a, you know, assistant producer and someone taking notes and, you know, a runner. So there was, you know, maybe 10 people staring at you while you had to do a piece to camera. And I genuinely really didn't like being looked at. So I just found it slightly overwhelming.
How ironic for your role, but I get it.
But yeah, you know, it was didn't really expect for it to happen. But of course, you know, TV opens up so many doors and offers up so many, you know, opportunities.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think although I'm always like, my ego is flattered by people saying that they like my TV programs. It's not really my happy place making TV. But I love the fact that it instantly did give me access to more and more people.
Yeah.
You know, because I get to go to people's gardens and film them, or I'd get to interview people about why they love gardening. And so that kind of fed this need of mine to kind of talk to people about why they care.
Yep. Right back to where you wanted to go.
Yeah. So I kind of put up with the weirdness.
That's what I call the dirty 30. I've said this before, but for everything that you love to do, there's 30% of that total that still you have to do that you don't like doing to do the 70% that allows you to say, I'm doing what I love doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
And actually probably quite good to have a 30% rule, right?
Yeah.
So when it becomes 50, then that's the wrong.
There you go. That's perfect. I like that too. Hey, real quick question though. When you were doing the Edible Garden series, did you have the big crew there too? Because there's not a lot of room in there to do everything.
No, that was what was really joyous about the Edible Garden is that we pitched this idea and they said, sure, we'll give you this kind of, you know, we'll give you this slot and you know, you can make up one season of it as a kind of almost experimental have a go. And one of the things we said was it would be a tiny crew. And it was really, most of it was Juliet Glaves, who was the director and also did a lot of the filming. And she was, and it still is, a very good friend.
Oh, good.
And so it was a very different, much more intimate experience because it was the two of us kind of coming up with, and she's got this incredible aesthetic eye. She's actually a really incredible florist now.
And how much of the writing and the outline and the topics were you involved in? Most of it, I'm guessing?
Maybe.
All of it?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yep.
I mean, that was one of the things is that I'd sort of craved
a
level of control that I suppose, you know, the mainstream TV was never going to give me.
Right. I get that 100%. In the 3 shows that I've hosted, I was the presenter for 2, with, you know, as you said, the same kind of crew, and I was just really doing the lines that had been scripted, or basically I was told what to say more or less, with slight input, even though I had all the background that they didn't. I don't know why they weren't listening more. But then I finally left in 2009, and then I started my own show on the equivalent of BBC here on PBS. And 12 years, 12 seasons, over 200 episodes, writing and producing and creating every episode myself. It's just relating to what you said, is that is so much more about what I think you and I both wanted to be able to do. And in the process, with every episode, I got to go to different parts of the country and interview those people to learn about what drove them to garden as well. So very parallel paths, Alys.
Congratulations for 12 years. That's impressive.
Oh, thank you. It takes its toll on you. Don't think it doesn't, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. TV is a funny business, isn't it? It's, it's wonderful, but it's a funny business.
Yeah, it is. And there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes that people have no idea what it takes to make that episode that they watch. But yeah.
Mm,
Back to you though.
mm.
Speaking of, things changing, you move on. And so I guess the main part of the TV side kind of goes away. And what are you doing after that? And trust me, I promise we're getting to peatlands, because that is truly what I want to talk about. But maybe it's personal curiosity, but we're building the story to get you to where you are with this book.
Yeah, so TV sort of abruptly came to an end because they decided to have a kind of new lineup, and a little bit of a reckoning, because although I didn't love it, I didn't really have, I did sort of suddenly feel like, oh gosh, what now? Like I felt a bit kind of like I hadn't had a plan, and suddenly this big change had come along. But by that point, I think I really began to understand how much writing was important for me.
Mm.
And I kind of thought, when they reshuffled everybody and I was kind of dropped from the BBC lineup, that like everybody would walk away from me. But to their credit, and I'm very grateful for, the Guardian didn't seem at all bothered whether I was on TV or not.
Mm.
So I had space to write in a really wonderful platform. I was writing every Saturday in the magazine. The sudden kind of space
Yeah.
in my work schedule meant that I could be, perhaps more ambitious about writing other things. So, I started to just more journalist work as a kind of garden writer. I started teaching a lot, which I really love.
Oh,
And teaching at all sorts of different levels, everything from like kindergarten kids in forest school to adult education, lecturing at universities, after school clubs, horticultural clubs, you name it. I've kind of been everywhere, and I love that work, gained so much from it. And I love doing workshops and practical stuff like that. So, the next couple of years were sort of taken up with doing bits and bobs like that, I suppose. Then I got this kind of wonderful break, really. I'd been asked by Tate Britain, which is a kind of very institutional art gallery in London, to come and do a talk after hours. And I could talk about anything I wanted in the gallery, but would I do it through the kind of lens of gardening? And so I decided, they would open up any gallery. So I decided to do a kind of tour of paintings which I felt were somehow important, to look at the paintings to understand the kind of British journey of gardening. I did this talk kind of around the gallery, and one of the guys who turned up was a wonderful publisher called Rupert Lancaster. And he then sent me a letter and said, do you want to come and have tea? I think you could maybe write things which are a bit beyond gardening. Do you want to come and talk about what you want to write about?
wow.
So I went and had a nice afternoon tea with him. And he said, like, be ambitious. What would you write about if you didn't have to kind of write a kind of gardening book? And I thought, I'll go away and think about it. And I sort of had this funny idea or need to have an adventure in my life. And for many different reasons, I couldn't leave Birmingham, which is the city I was living in. So I couldn't, go off to Peru, or I don't know, wherever I thought I should go to have an adventure. So I suddenly thought, I need to have an adventure here in my hometown. And I need to feel like I have freedom in my life. And Birmingham is famous for having more canals than Venice.
Wow.
It's kind of the Detroit of the UK. So it's a kind of a town that completely came into being from the Industrial Revolution, and is a manufacturing town. So it's a town that's famous for its factories. And when kind of Birmingham was born, they made a canal network to get all this stuff around. Train work came. So it's got over 200 miles of canals in the city.
Oh.
And I thought, I wonder if you can do them all. Now, if you go to Birmingham, they've cleaned a lot of them up. But even back then, if you went to the canal, what you'd find was like a lot of shopping trolleys and bicycles that people had thrown in. They were
Oh,
not
no.
necessarily, some stretches were very recreational, but lots of them are actually behind the back of a factory. And you can't even necessarily walk to them. You can only get to them by being on the water. And they're not really in any way used commercially anymore
Wow.
to move anything around industry. So,
Right.
I mean, that stopped kind of 150 years ago.
Yeah. But the canals are
So,
still there. Yeah.
yeah. So, a long story short, I thought, I know, I will canoe them and I will write about all. Because the wonderful thing is that although they have been abandoned by industry and us, they weren't in any way abandoned by wildlife.
Right.
And so they are just these extraordinary and magical, some bits of them are, where like nobody can get to them unless you're on the water. And they have just been kind of re-inhabited by a very strange kind of ecology that is made up of all sorts of things and all over the world. So it's not necessarily kind of native British plants. They're all sorts of things which have blown in and flown in and you know, they're these novel habitats basically, because the canal is totally man-made. There
Yeah.
wasn't a river there.
Mm.
So the water is, you know, everything about it is man-made, but they're now kind of
Nature's
nature.
taking it back.
Yeah. You know, and I thought this will be wonderful. I will write about the fact that if you just prepared to look of the wildness running through the city. And I wrote that as a kind of as a nature writing book. And that really it allowed me to kind of flex some muscles, I suppose, around writing and to look at writing about things differently and writing about a lot more science, I suppose.
That became a book, and the title was
Hidden nature.
Hidden Nature. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Great title.
Which also had a memoir element. So it had a very personal element to it too,
Mhm.
because it was kind of a coming out story.
Right.
Sort of strangely like spending so much time on the canals at that point in my life gave me space enough to start to think about why I'd sort of taken myself to this strange place in the first
Mhm.
instance.
Mhm.
Also, my canoe is a blow up canoe, so it goes very slowly. So I didn't get anywhere fast. And all of this time going very slowly on this very flat water, I realized I sort of was purposefully taking myself off to this strange place because I needed to think about things and sort of so there's a kind of undercurrent in the book, which is this coming out story.
Yeah.
Live
Re
my truth.
Yeah, sure.
When I came to the end of writing that book, people sent me lots of books on canal. And I realized that they've always been places that people take themselves to who are trying to find different stories about themselves.
Wow.
The kind of, yeah, there's this funny thing about them. They're, because they're not conventional spaces, I
Mm.
suppose, and because also they're not very peopled, it turns out that I'm not the first, and I don't suppose I'll ever be the last.
Right.
I
But
took myself there to find something else about themselves.
yeah. But you did that independently of knowing that that's a thing that many other people found themselves
Yeah,
doing as well. You found that after the fact. That's interesting.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Let's segue into the main topic here, but thank you for sharing all of that very interesting information and what a background. As you said, your path between how you directed it or through the help of your mother leading you through the way, you found all the right places, it seems like, or many of them that kept you landing on your feet. One question I have for you as we go into this peatland topic is, as a gardener, back when you were really busy with your gardening life, you were peat-free for over 20 years now, I think.
Hmm.
I mean, what was that connection that you realized, "I'm gonna be peat-free"? What information was going on in your head to lead you to that decision? It seems to me you were way ahead of the game because here in the States, that's I think we're mostly learning about it just from what we hear from the UK.
Yeah. So interestingly, Kew Gardens decided to make itself peat free, possibly like over 30 years ago.
Oh.
So when I went to Kew, it was just the given. We
Oh.
wouldn't, you know, Kew's motto is we won't destroy someone else's habitat to make our own. And they very much understood that peat bogs were essential and very specific habitats that had a lot of endemic things on them. So the stuff that grows on a peat bog cannot grow anywhere else. So
Mhm.
they had this hard and fast rule that they would be peat free. Now, the RHS, who was my other bit of my apprenticeship, so, these are the big giants of the UK
Yes.
horticultural industry, right? So you have
Right.
Kew Gardens, it's like, no way we won't use it. And the RHS still isn't peat-free. And I, at 19, was really struck by this. I was like, here they are, two institutions, both of them absolutely phenomenally good at growing plants to an incredible standard. And one lot says you can't do it without peat, and the other one says you must not do it with peat.
Hmm.
And that struck me in lots of different ways, but also in kind of a 19-year-old stubborn way. I was just like, why won't the RHS do it? So literally, I think on my first day, I was like, why aren't you people? Kind of constantly was sort of, I mean, I got in so much trouble for it, so anyway, we won't get into that. But I was endlessly like a kind of like, why won't you be peat-free? Why won't you be peat-free? And then I've had almost 25 years of writing, essentially, in my life, or communicating about gardening, and we're still not peat-free.
Yeah.
So I understood that just asking people to be peat-free was not enough. That you can say, look, these are really important places, and you can say they're really important for the environment, but people really need to know why.
Yeah.
And also people need to be able to invest in that story of why, or else change just doesn't happen. And so I decided to quit my job at The Guardian. Been at The Guardian for kind of 12 years, and I loved it, but like it was sort of keeping me in a routine that wasn't going to allow enough space to really stop and study this subject of peat bogs and peatlands and why they were important and whatnot. And I decided I'd kind of give myself a kind of grace, 2 years, saved up enough money that I'd sort of take a leap, and I would spend a whole year studying so that I could write a book. And that's essentially what I did. And that meant going to loads of peat bogs and talking to lots of scientists and climbing up
You did. That
mountains.
yes, yes, yes. And so I will inject just my take on reading your book and listening to your book, which I did both. And I was telling you before we started, just when I really enjoy a book, I like to read it, but I love to hear the book being read by the author. And you read this book, and your passion for this time that you took to write what you wrote, and just your love and your earnestness to help other people understand the importance of peat bogs clearly came through the whole way through the book. I'm sure that was at least a quiet goal of yours, but it certainly came through. But in justice to, yeah, you're welcome. But in justice to really your mission with writing this book, awareness and so much more, can I get you to maybe give us sort of the overview so that we can have a common ground, a place to start with? Remind us, for those who don't know or know and need to hear it again, what are these peat bogs? Where are they? And why are we now writing about it and talking about it so much more than we ever did? And why peat-free? Just, you get where I'm going with that, but I think we need to set the stage for,
Yeah,
yeah.
of course. So you can find peat all the way around the globe. You can find it in the tropics, frozen. You can find it all the way through Russia. You can find it in great meters of stuff all the way through Eastern Europe, UK. You can find it in Africa. You can find it in Australia. It's in the Congo Basin. There's huge amounts of it in the US and Canada.
Yeah.
And the reason why you find peat around the globe is because it is a way of the Earth's system storing carbon. So whenever the system started to heat up, biogeoengineering system that is Earth needed to find a way to bank carbon for a long time so that that heating up process wouldn't run out of control. And one of the ways the Earth does it is through forests and seaweed, another carbon storage, a very important one. But in terms of soil, although quite a lot of carbon is stored in soils and forests, the most carbon in any soil system will be in a peatland. That could be a peat bog or it could be a fen. That's essentially what the Earth is doing, is using the peat bog to make an air conditioning unit. I think that's the best way to
Yes.
They are cooling the Earth and keeping it also humid and making sure we have good, clean air to breathe. So there's not, we all understand that that's a really important thing and an ever important thing at this point in our time, because we're clearly pouring more carbon into our atmosphere than we have ever done before. So we need these peatlands to remain as carbon sinks and stores. So they need to keep hold of that carbon. But unfortunately, around the world, for many and various different reasons, and one of them is because of extraction for peat for compost, when a peat bog or a fen is drained and is no longer wet, the peat starts to break down and it releases carbon dioxide. So the peatland remains carbon store because it is wet. They are always wet, wet, wet places. When you think about a bog, that's exactly what you think of, right? Like it's a saturated space that is made of soupy material. It's really important that it's saturated because that's how it holds onto the carbon. And then the minute that it is drained in any kind of way, then it starts releasing the carbon. And there's many different reasons why peatlands are threatened at the moment. And that's partly climate change, land use, agriculture. But for us as gardeners, one of the most kind of pertinent reasons for us is that it's this extraction for peat compost. And actually, the interesting thing about it is it's really not a long history. We haven't been making peat compost forever. It's a really short history. It became really a big commercial thing in about the 1960s when garden centres and plastic pots became a thing. So plastic wall injection allows you to make a plastic pot rather than a terracotta pot, and that's much cheaper to move around the country. So you have an industry of making plants in one place and selling them somewhere else. And then the garden centre is born, because before that, what you had to do was wait for the right season. And so you would order a plant from a nursery and then they would dig it up in the winter and send it to you. Plastic pot changes everything. And then with the plastic pot, when you're going to be transporting and transplanting plants around the place, you want a really light medium. And peat moss, so the extracted peat from the peat bog, is a very light, very airy, once it's no longer wet, very amenable subject matter for plants to grow in. And also people have, until this point, thought that peat bogs were pretty much useless. Not very productive places. So to dig them up and extract their peat seemed to people like a good use of them. But now we know differently. And we know that they store more carbon than all the above vegetation in the world. So all the rainforests, all the prairies, anything you can think of green is a fraction of the amount of carbon that is stored in peat bogs, because peat bogs can be meters upon meters upon meters.
Deep.
So, we need to care about peat bogs and peatlands universally because they are doing wonderful things to allow us to live on this place that we call home. But as gardeners, we are unwittingly in this act of trying to be caring for our environment and do the right thing. We're often extracting something that has a huge environmental input. It's just, I cannot tell you how much carbon dioxide is released when you dig up any amount of peat. So it doesn't matter what you grow, it's never gonna write that equation. Even if you decide to grow the biggest trees you could think of, even in the lifetime of the tree, it would never make up the amount of carbon that you extracted just to use the peat compost. So it is really imperative that we stop doing it, because it's frankly stupid. We are environmentally in a very tenuous point in our timeline, and digging up a bit of peat bog to grow a petunia is like, I mean, honestly, they will look back at us in the future and think we were like the Romans. We were just mad. That's also so woven into my own story, because although I have been peat-free at home and I make my own compost and I buy in peat-free compost, there's almost nobody in the gardening industry who doesn't have peat somewhere on them, because when you buy in a plant from a garden centre, maybe a bit of peat, or lots of supermarket plants, so the supermarket herbs that the basils and stuff like that you buy growing, they are nearly all grown in peat. A lot of our agriculture is grown in drain peat. It affects us all, and we all have a part to play in helping peat bogs not only remain intact, but the ones which are damaged become restored. And there's a huge community of people who are working hard to do this, but our part to play in it, I suppose, more than anything else, is to stop using peat. To examine that relationship. Basically, you have to go cold turkey and learn
Yeah.
how to grow slightly different in peat-free compost. But it's really doable. And as a gardener, it's probably one of the most significant things you can do environmentally.
What do you use if you're making your own that's peat-free? What are your inputs that substitute for the peat? Asking for a friend and for all the people that wanna know exactly what they can do, because I
Um,
know many people feel this way.
yes. So I do buy in peat-free compost.
Mhm.
So I will buy in, a percentage of that every year. And then I will sieve my own homemade garden compost.
Yep.
I use very little of that actually because it's, tends to be quite rich in nutrients and mostly what I'm starting stuff off in pots is just seedlings. So clearly I do not need that kind of
Right.
level of nutrient for seedlings. So I use a lot of leaf mold. So that's leaves that I've collected in the autumn and
Yeah.
rotted down for a year to 2 years. And I use a lot of leaf mold and I also use a lot of composted bark mulch.
Yeah.
And you can either buy that in or you just get a load of bark mulch from forestry and make a corner of your garden and just let it rot, which takes a bit of time, but it's the cheaper way to do it. And at various times, I've also done soil blocks. Do you know that?
Yeah, oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So I also will make soil blocks with my own soil with sieved and then maybe with a bit of compost mixed in to make it kind of stick.
Right, the glue part, yeah. When you use your leaf mold for your seedlings and maybe seed starting, are you using all leaf mold, or are you mixing in a little bit of compost or the bark, or
Just
what's your
I actually
recipe?
think pure leaf mold is the most magical seedling stuff ever.
Nice to hear.
It's really low in nutrient. It really holds on to moisture when it needs to, but is also really, once it's really fine,
Yeah.
it's very free draining.
Mhm.
So I might mix it with a bit of sand if I have some kicking around, although sand has its own implications because it's not necessarily that sustainable because it's also an extracted soil product. And actually, more and more and more, I'm really looking at the garden, which means that I don't have to raise things in pots and plant them out so much. So, one of the interesting things about this whole journey, writing the book Peatlands, was it made me really look at breeding vegetables because I realized that so much of the cycle of having to start off these seeds and seed trays and then pricking them out and putting them into modules and then planting them out was to ensure these kind of early conditions of little or no competition, because that's how these vegetables need to get going in order to be successful. And it made me step back and say, why have we come up with this system? It's not really like in the wild, the ancestors of these vegetables in any way needed any of this, right? They just set seed and that seed comes up in the right place.
Yes.
Why? What happens if you actually stop making the assumption that this is the way to garden and you consider gardening in a really different way? So one of the things now, I mean, my garden looks really bonkers to most people. And I mean, it looks bonkers to me. But is that I have at any given year, I have maybe probably a third, sometimes more, of plants which are at some point in their life cycle setting seed, and I allow them to set seed wherever they want.
Yep.
So I no longer have a garden which is kind of, oh, this is where the cabbages grow, and this is where the kale grow, and this is where the tomatoes. Like I let those plants live out their entire life cycle. I let that seed, some of the seed I collect. Increasingly, if I don't have to collect the seed because it won't rot over the winter or something like that, I just allow them to self seed wherever they want.
Wow.
So right now, in order to walk up a path, you have to kind of push aside a huge kale that has been in the most improbable place. I mean, just ridiculous. Nobody would put a kale there. But what I'm working towards and already actually beginning to see is that I'm doing a kind of land race gardening where I'm
Mm.
getting these plants to very much adapt to the ecology of my space and allowing them to grow where they thrive, which means that they need a lot less inputs. And then I'm allowing that the next generation to set seed. And suddenly I've got a whole garden that's kind of looking after itself.
Wow.
And that's been really interesting. And I didn't see that coming at all. But being on the peat bogs made me go like, oh, wow, I've been, made me really assess a lot of gardening and realize how controlling it is, but also how that control just goes back and back and back right the way to the seed packet. So that's been really interesting.
That is so fascinating, and I took you down a rabbit hole there. I don't know if you have that expression over there, but just
Yeah,
took you down a side
totally.
road.
Alice in Wonderland.
Right, right. I'm so glad we did go there, and I'd love to talk more about it, but I also wanna get a little more enlightenment on some of the questions I had for you on the peat bogs. Before we do, I had a question as you were speaking that I wanted to address, and that is, my understanding is that the UK has basically banned the use of peat or have kind of declared a nationwide endeavor to go peat-free as of is it next year or this year, 2026? And even
Yeah.
even if they do, though, what's to prevent imports from all over the rest of the world coming in? Is that
Nothing.
nothing,
And
huh?
actually, the ban is not legal.
Yeah.
So it's kind of in legislation, but doesn't have any clout behind it. There is totally a strong movement. There is so much peat nurseries who are completely peat free now. And there is a strong and growing movement, but it is not a legally forced ban by any means. And even if and when the ban comes into completion, which I do believe will happen, but it is dragging its heels, let's put it that way.
Right.
There are people who have licenses to extract peat bogs for as long as there's peat in the ground. So there's so many, like any of these things, there's so many loopholes, which is
Yes.
why I sort of, I talk a lot to people about the fact that, although it is important and necessary from so many things in society and life to have a kind of legal framework and to have a kind of political drive for things to happen, we can't actually wait for that to happen in order to make sure that we're doing the right thing. We need to do the right thing because it's morally good for future generations and future gardeners to stop using peat, not wait for someone to say, and now it's law.
Yes.
That is too slow. And it's
Yeah.
always going to be too slow because that's what policy is. It's always a little bit behind by the very nature of complications and philosophical element of what law is. So yes, we are the leaders worldwide, I would say, for peat-free gardening, but my God, we have a long way to go. There is a lot of work. And like you say, there's nothing to stop anybody importing peat, grown plants and peat-based compost into the UK.
Yeah.
And so that is a worry. However, on the other side of that, I think many governments understand that getting their peat bogs restored is such an easy climate win that it makes more sense to restore them than it does to extract them. So you definitely are seeing an impetus in a lot of governments to just get the restoration work done. And in order for a bog to be restored, it has to be re-wetted, and you can't extract peat from a re-wetted bog. So in some ways that is happening, but there are so many places where for economic reasons, extracting still will make sense. So it's a complicated picture, I think, worldwide.
Mm. Regarding all this extraction of these peat bogs around the world, we didn't talk about how long it takes to actually create peat and how you mentioned how deep they are, meters and meters deep in many, many cases. But the time it takes to create a bog of meters deep is
Mm-hmm.
multiple thousands of years, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So and this is a very important detail, a healthy bog, and around the world, I think that something like 80% of bogs are considered damaged and very much not healthy, so are unhealthy. Yeah, that's a startling statistic. A healthy bog grows a millimeter a year.
Phew.
So 1,000 years gives you a meter of peat. And to extract peat, you have to go at least half a meter deep to get to the peat that would be any good to grow in. Because the
Yeah.
top half is, for many different reasons, not of the right consistency to be extracted. So you're at minimum going 500 years down, but much more likely you're going 800, 1,000 years.
Gosh.
So you're extracting them that was saved a long time ago, but
Mm.
there's no way, like at any time scale, is that ever going to grow back in our lifetimes
No.
or even our great grandchildren's lifetime. What I say to people, and I feel like this has been an emotive thing, but that's the whole point of being a bit campaigny, is that, using peat compost is like demanding elephant tusks or
Mm.
wearing fur coats.
Mm.
It's not, we just wouldn't do that anymore. We know that it's wrong. That is
Right.
just outrageous. And that's sort of how we have to start thinking about peat, because not only is it in itself an incredible being, a peat bog, and so that is ancient material that has its own culture and its own way of being ecologically and is supporting a huge amount of an ecosystem above ground. So, for that reason alone, we should do it. But if you don't actually care about the peat bog, which I can accept, but some people are just not interested in peat bogs, you should care for yourself, because the amount of carbon that's being released is genuinely jeopardizing our climate.
Yeah. I'm just
It's
dwelling
a
on what
heavy
you said.
subject.
It's heavy. Yeah, I know. I'm dwelling on that and taking a
Yeah.
breath to soak that in.
Yeah, because also we're doing it because we love growing things, and we're
Yeah.
doing it because we want to make our environment for us and for our neighbors and for the people we love more beautiful, and we want to feed people. And, so it's like, I really get how much of a kind of conundrum it is, because
Yeah.
no is extracting peat to grow plants because they want to be cruel or mean, or, they're doing it out of loving gesture of wanting to clothe the world in beauty and flowers. Yet, unfortunately, is doing the opposite. And that's something we have to reckon with as gardeners, I think, because we can't, it's too critical right now in terms of our climate for us to keep carrying on with this. And so we need to admit the mistake that we didn't understand and change. And then that needs to happen pretty much as quickly as possible.
Yeah. It's not okay to just look away anymore.
No, not
Yeah.
really. Also, although it now seems like really heavy and like, oh God, oh no, we're terrible people. It's actually it's a very small gesture. It's a very small part of gardening. It's really easy to grow peat-free. Even if you can't find peat-free compost, you can make your own, you know. I mean, yes, it takes a bit more time, but you love gardening anyhow. So
Yeah.
it's not really a hardship to spend more time in your garden, is it?
No. As far as an alternative to a medium that we can grow into, whether it's starting seeds or seedlings, that doesn't include peat, have you had any success using? I can't pronounce it the way you do in the UK. Cool. I can't even do it. I
Oh,
say
yeah.
core just because it's easier to
Yeah.
say that.
Yes. I mean, that the problem, I mean, it is a good substitute, but the problem with that it's also not that great environmentally,
Right.
in that it largely comes from Sri Lanka, and it's made up of the husks of
Yep.
coconut-based fiber, and then it has to be sent over. And so there's a footprint in that. I mean, it's lovely stuff to grow in. What I think is more interesting is to actually think about the soil food web and the importance of health in your garden and growing your vegetables and flowers. And that actually you have a local microbial community. So you have a hyperlocal one to your back garden.
Yeah.
And making a product in and from your garden is actually going to improve the soil food web, is going to improve how your seedlings communicate with your soil system. So from when you've got them out of the pot into the ground, all of that has a dramatic effect on how well things grow. So, although the convenience of something like Goya is great, and then, the kind of footprint aside, I understand why people want to go over to it. Actually, working towards a system where you make your own compost or you buy locally made compost is going to have such a radical effect on the biodiversity of the microbial community in your soil, then that's the thing to go for. And that's the
Okay.
exciting bit about it. It's like we've been sold through late capitalism this idea that we should buy compost that is made in one place and then used in another place. Actually, if you want to do some really radically good and radically exciting environmental gardening, your own compost and make your own potting compost, because you will shorten the gap between the microbes that you're bringing in and the microbes that exist in your soil. And once you can get them down to a very kind of hyper localized level, you will start to see the health of your plants just improve so quickly. So that's a good bit. It's cheaper or free. It's good for the environment. It's good for future generations. And it's really good for your own soil.
Little did I know when I asked that question, I was going to get such a fantastic answer. I love your response, and I'm so glad that I just curiously asked that question. Real quick, Alys, something you said just for clarification. You mentioned that a healthy bog, if I got this right, that's really the only peat that can be extracted. But what makes a bog unhealthy? Is it because it dries out for whatever reason?
A healthy bog is the only sustainable bog, and that can't be extracted from. So it's still taking in carbon and it's sinking it down.
Okay.
And that's what makes it a really important ecosystem, because it's storing thousands of years of carbon, but it's also taking in carbon on a daily basis and continuing to store it. So it's the air conditioning unit is working. It's not just an air conditioning unit, but it's turned off. It's an air conditioning unit turned on. A damaged bog can be damaged for many different reasons, but the underlying factor in a damaged bog is that it has no longer got sovereignty of its waters.
Oh.
So for one reason or another, it has been drained and it is losing or has lost its peat to be growing. It needs to be wet right the way to the surface of the peat bog or the fen. So it's completely saturated in water.
Yeah.
Only when it's saturated in water and it has its living layer can it continue to grow. So a damaged one will either have had drains put in it for agriculture, or maybe a road has been put through the middle of it, or perhaps a building has been built on the site of it, or it has had its top layer scraped back and it is now being dug into on an industrial level for compost. So that's what a damaged bog is. It's a bog without its water.
Okay. And the living layer, we hear about peat moss incessantly, but we also hear about sphagnum moss. And is that generally the living layer? Or
Yeah. So sphagnum moss is like the ecosystem engineer.
Yes.
So they are actually driving the whole ship. The most extraordinary plants in the world, because the sphagnum moss probably on a really good year, an extraordinary good year, and it's having a great time, perhaps would grow 10 centimeters, but most of them grow like a centimeter a year. They're tiny things, right? And yet they're like, I cannot tell you, the powerhouse of all this carbon storage is happening because of these mosses. Sphagnum mosses only grow on peat, and most of them crave acidic conditions, hence why they are found on peat bogs, because that's the big difference. A peat bog, so a bog is acidic and a fen is alkali.
Okay.
And the sphagnum moss is doing all of this work. So and that living layer needs to be intact too. It's it's like the skin on top of the bog, basically. It's keeping the whole thing together. So another small sideline industry that can be quietly quite problematic is sphagnum moss or floristry, because that can be wild harvested, and the bog really needs its skin intact. It doesn't really help to have holes picked into it.
One thing I heard you say about sphagnum moss is you described it as the filter that basically takes in all the nutrients from the rain. What little nutrients are coming down from the rain, it's taking all that in, and then it's using the cation exchange capacity that it has to hold on to those nutrients, but it releases the acid, and that's really the pickling effect. Basically, you likened it to how we pickle things so that they are preserved forever, is that the acid going down is what prevents the peat from rotting. Did I get that right?
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
Yes.
This little plant is like doing all this carbon storage, and it's doing it by basically pickling itself and everything around it. One of my biggest obsessions is fermenting food. I have always got some weird thing fermenting in my kitchen at any given moment. And a peat bog is basically a giant pickling pot. I was like, I have found my happy place.
So that's why you wrote the book, and that's why you traveled everywhere to go see all those. I get it now.
Yeah. But it all makes sense. It's all down to good fermented products.
This has been the most fascinating discussion, and you've been so gracious with your time and sharing your knowledge. And I know we barely scratched the surface, speaking of surface, but Alys, how would you like to end your conversation with me today with a a call to action or anything else that we didn't talk about today that you want to make sure gets out there
I
today?
just so believe in gardens. I know we're a good bunch. And so I know that once we're given knowledge, we will, or actually prepared to change. I never believe this notion that somehow we're all like stuck in our ways. I don't think it's true. I think the thing that made you a gardener made you curious and experimental and thrifty and and like so keen to get your hands in the earth. And so I really believe that we can give up peat compost. I believe we can do it really quickly. I have total faith. I understand it's been a long route to here, but the time is now. I'm there for anybody who wants to give it a go.
Whew, what a journey from a childhood spent beneath orchard trees to a deeper and urgent love for the world's peatlands. Alys Fowler reminds us that gardening isn't just about what we grow, it's about how we connect to place, to purpose, and to the living systems that sustain us. And if today's conversation has you rethinking what's in your potting mix or simply looking at wild spaces a little differently, Alys will be very happy about that. And that's the power of a gardener who goes beyond the garden. That's Alys. And maybe that's you and me too. It should be all of us, especially now. So roll the tape back on that one and let that sink in for a while. And as gardeners, we have the power to influence and be the spark of many changes in vital ways these days. And there's no better time to put that power into practice than right now. And here are just a few final notes. Now that all the current and future episodes of our podcast can be watched right here on YouTube, and when the video feed is good, you'll see our entire video conversation. And when the feed is not so good like it was today, in this episode, you can still listen, and we'll insert what we can to visually help show and tell the story as you listen along, like with today's episode. But be sure to subscribe and be notified so every time we post our next episode video, you'll know about it. And if you like watching good gardening television content, then be sure to check out our other YouTube channel that has all the episodes from my Emmy Award-winning public television series, Growing a Greener World. That's over 200 episodes for you to view in their entirety. And that channel is GGW TV on YouTube. So thanks again to Alys Fowler for sharing her incredible knowledge and passion for peatlands with all of us today, and to my incredible podcast production team, Amy Prentice, Brendan O'Reilly, and Christine LaFond, and certainly thanks to you. And if you're a regular listener or viewer, I so appreciate that. And if you just found us, welcome, and thanks for being here. My goal for every episode is to help you take the guesswork out of gardening by teaching you the why-do behind the how-to so that you can become a better, smarter, more confident gardener. I'll be back here again next week for another episode of The Joe Gardener Show, and I look forward to having you right back here to join me for that. So until then, have a great week, take care, and I'll see you back here really soon.